Thanks. I'll save my remarks for after the film, if I can find it. But I'm going to show you guys just a short excerpt, the first 7 minutes, which gives a historical overview of the case.
Every day, thousands of Americans cross paths with our criminal justice system.
If you don't have adequate defense, you're going to jail.
Every day, this nightmare happens to somebody. Somebody who can't afford an attorney to fight vigorously and against everything for them.
Money speaks his own language, and so does the law. If you don't speak it fluently, you can get yourself into a lot of trouble.
80% of the people who come in contact with our criminal justice system rely on the services of court-appointed lawyers. But this fundamental right is under threat. It is a fundamental right we must defend. And it all started 50 years ago with a man named Clarence Earl Gideon.
You know, it would be nice to think of Clarence Earl Gideon as a romantic figure from some old-time movie with a mustache and a hat and a dashing style. Not at all. He was a beaten-down 50-year-old man who looked like he was 75 and had the worst of life. That's what he looked like. That's what he was.
On June 3rd, 1961, Clarence Earl Gideon was arrested in Panama City, Florida. He was charged with breaking and entering into the Bay Harbor pool room. Reported stolen some wine and change from the vending machines. Gideon maintained his innocence. He had no money for bail, so he was kept in the county jail for 2 months awaiting trial. He had no money for a lawyer either.
The next case on the docket is the case of State of Florida versus Clarence Earl Gideon. What says the defendant? Are you ready for trial?
I'm not ready, Your Honor.
Well, why aren't you ready?
I request this court to appoint counsel to represent me in this trial.
Well, Mr. Gideon, I'm sorry, but I cannot appoint counsel to represent you in this case. Under the laws of the state of Florida, the only time the court can appoint counsel to represent a defendant is when that person is charged with a capital offense.
I did not understand that it was going to become a major case. In every case in a state court where there was a death sentence, the state court was obliged to furnish a lawyer to a defendant who was too poor to hire one. In addition, you're entitled to have a lawyer appointed if there were special circumstances such that you could say it was unfair, unjust for this defendant to have been tried without a lawyer. And there were no special circumstances in Gideon's case.
I'm sorry, but I will have to deny your request to appoint counsel to defend you in this case.
The United States Supreme Court says I am entitled to be represented by counsel.
Well, let the record show that the defendant has asked the court to appoint counsel to represent him in this trial.
So I hope that clip gives a sense of what the rest of the film is. It's a half-an-hour short film that interweaves the historical narrative of Gideon's case. And this is footage, this is the real Clarence Earl Gideon who used a transcript of his trial and reenacted his trial on CBS Nightly News. And we were able to use the footage. And it's the story of Gideon's case interwoven with 4 stories of contemporary injustice about people who were not even afforded the barest minimum of adequate defense in their cases, and the heartbreaking consequences of what happens when people who don't have adequate lawyers represent them in court. The film, we had access to 4 luminaries who were involved in the case. Abe Crash, who you see, who worked on the appellate case, on Gideon's appeal. Bruce Jacob, who represented the state of Florida and then dedicated the rest of his life to pro bono indigent defense and teaching criminal law. Walter Mondale, who wrote an amicus brief on behalf of Gideon as the Attorney General of Minnesota, and Tony Lewis, who wrote the wonderful book about Gideon. We shot this interview in January of this year, and as many of you know, in March, Tony passed away, and his wife spoke to me later and said this was actually the last interview that was filmed with Tony Lewis, and the last interview that he saw before his passing, and that normally he was very critical of interviews he'd done and films he'd been in, and he looked at this and he said it is quite good. So it felt like a great mark of success for the film. I'll just talk very briefly about the way the Constitution Project has used this film in the service of promoting criminal justice reform. The film premiered at the Department of Justice, introduced by Eric Holder last March. It was broadcast on C-SPAN. There have been over 170 screenings of this film in classrooms and for organizations and at law firms across the country. Reformers have been able to use this film and organize screenings. Later in the film, there's interviews with Representative Tom McMillan in Michigan, who is a Tea Party Republican, but who thinks we should spend less money on fixing potholes. But when the government wants to take away your freedom, he says, then we need to spend money to defend those rights. He screened the film in the Michigan State Legislature immediately before they passed comprehensive indigent defense reform. So that felt like a huge success. There's a teacher's guide available for free online, and there's DVDs on the front table that are also available for free if any of you guys are interested in watching the film or in thinking through how to set up a screening in the service of the important work that you do. So I'll be around for a little while if you want to ask questions, but thanks for watching our clip.